The wind didn't just blow through the Laramie Valley in the winter of 1888. It screamed. Caleb Mercer sat in his farmhouse, a loaded Colt Peacemaker on the table and a foreclosure notice in the fire waiting for the end. He was a man who had buried his past and sealed his heart. But then came the knock. It wasn't the bank, and it wasn't the law. It was two identical little girls, shivering in the sleet, looking a hardened gunman dead in the eye with a terrifying proposition. They said, "We heard you needed a man. Our papa loves you." Caleb didn't know it then, but those 7 words were about to bring a war to his doorstep. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the brutal, true story of how the West was won, not by guns, but by a secret that refused to die. The silence of the Broken Spoke Ranch was usually a comfort to Caleb Mercer. It was a silence he had purchased with 15 years of sweat, a bad leg, and a reputation that kept folks in town from asking too many questions. But tonight, the silence felt heavy, like the dirt thrown over a coffin. Caleb sat in his high-backed leather chair, staring at the ledger spread open on the oak table. The numbers didn't add up. They hadn't added up since the blizzard of '86 wiped out half his herd. Now, with winter scratching at the door again, the Laramie Bank, specifically, a snake named Jedediah Croft, was ready to swallow the Broken Spoke whole. Caleb rubbed his temples. He was 38, but the mirror showed a man of 50. His dark hair was threaded with silver, and his hands were scarred maps of barbed wire cuts and burn marks. He reached for the bottle of whiskey, his only companion on nights when the wind howled like a banshee. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was small, hesitant. It barely rose above the rattle of the window panes. Caleb froze. His hand drifted from the bottle to the grip of the revolver sitting on the ledger. No one came out this far past sunset, not unless they were lost or looking for trouble. He stood his left knee protesting with a sharp ache and walked to the heavy timber door. He unlatched the iron bolt and pulled it open, bracing himself against a gust of freezing rain. He expected a bandit. He expected the sheriff. He expected Jedediah Croft's hired thugs. He did not expect to look down. Standing on his porch, drenched to the bone, were 2 girls. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They were identical, wrapped in oversized patchwork wool coats that smelled of wet dog and wood smoke. Their blonde hair was plastered to their foreheads, and they were shivering so violently their teeth chattered in unison. Caleb stared the gun dangling uselessly at his side. "What in the blazes?" The girl on the left, who had a smudge of grease on her chin, stepped forward. She looked terrified, but held her ground with a grit that Caleb recognized. It was the kind of grit you learned when you had nothing else. "Are you Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her voice high and trembling. "I am." Caleb rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "Who belongs to you?" "You're 10 miles from town." The girl on the right spoke up this time. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest. "We heard things, Mr. Mercer. In town? At the general store." Caleb narrowed his eyes, shielding them from the stinging rain. "Heard what?" "We heard you needed a man on the ranch," the first girl said. "We heard all the hands left, 'cause you can't pay 'em." Caleb felt a flush of shame heat his neck. It was true. The last hand, a boy named Hurried Toby, had left 2 days ago. "That ain't exactly business for children. Now where are your parents?" The twins exchanged a look. It was a look of deep, conspired understanding. "We brought a man," the first girl said. "He's the best worker in the territory. He can break horses, fix fences, and he don't drink until the sun is down." "And he's cheap," the second girl added helpfully. Caleb almost laughed. It was absurd. "I ain't hiring little ones. I'm about to lose this place. Now come inside before you freeze to death, and I'll hitch the wagon to take you home." The girls didn't move. The wind whipped their coats around their small legs. "He's waiting by the gate," the first girl said, pointing into the pitch-black darkness of the driveway. "He was too scared to come up. He said you'd shoot him." Caleb frowned. "Why would I shoot a stranger looking for work?" The girl took a deep breath. She looked up at Caleb, her blue eyes wide and piercing. "Because he ain't a stranger, and he said to tell you—" She hesitated, glancing at her sister for courage. "He said, 'Our papa loves you.'" The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The sleet suspended in the air. Caleb gripped the doorframe so hard, a splinter dug into his palm. The air left his lungs. There was only one person who had ever known Caleb well enough to fear him, and only one man Caleb had ever truly known in the years before the ranch, before the hardness set in. "Julian," Caleb whispered. The name tasted like ash and honey. "Is that his name?" Caleb barked louder than he intended. The girls nodded. "Julian Hayes. I'm Hattie. She's Clara." Caleb looked past them into the dark. He saw a silhouette standing by the split-rail fence, head bowed, a battered Stetson pulled low against the storm. "He loves you," Clara repeated, ensuring the message was delivered. "That's why we knocked. He said you wouldn't turn us away if we said that." Caleb looked at the shivering children, then at the ghost of his past standing in the mud. He stepped back and swung the door wide open. "Get in," he growled, "before the heat gets out." The kitchen was warm, smelling of the pine logs crackling in the cast-iron stove. Caleb had given the girls blankets and set a kettle on the boil. They sat at the table, swinging their legs, watching him with curious eyes. The door opened again, and the wind swirled in, bringing with it a man who looked like he had walked through hell to get there. Julian Hayes stepped inside and closed the door softly. He was thinner than Caleb remembered. The dashing charm of their youth in Savannah before the war, before the migration, West had been eroded by hard years. His cheekbones were sharp, his coat was threadbare, and his boots were held together with twine. But the eyes were the same. Hazel, intelligent, and currently filled with a mixture of hope and mortification. He took off his hat, wringing it in his hands. Water pooled on the floorboards. "Caleb," Julian said. His voice was a low baritone that Caleb hadn't heard in 12 years. "Julian." Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, keeping distance between them. "You look like a drowned rat." "Feel like one, too." Julian glanced at the twins. "Hattie, Clara, I told you to wait in the wagon." "The wagon has no roof, Papa," Hattie said matter-of-factly, "and you were taking too long getting your courage up." Julian winced, a faint blush rising on his pale cheeks. He looked back at Caleb. They have a way of taking charge. Their mother was the same. "Mary?" Caleb asked. Julian looked down at his boots. "She passed 3 years ago. Smallpox." A heavy silence settled over the room. Caleb felt a pang of sympathy he didn't want to feel. He and Julian had been inseparable once. They had ridden together, planned futures together. But when Caleb had come west to claim land, Julian had stayed behind for Mary. Caleb had left without saying goodbye, a coward running from a feeling he couldn't name and a rejection he couldn't face. "I'm sorry," Caleb said stiffly. "Yeah, me too." Julian looked up, his expression hardening into desperation. "Look, Cal, I know how this looks. I haven't seen you in a decade, and I show up on your doorstep with 2 mouths to feed. But we lost the farm in Nebraska, locusts. Then the bank took the rest. We've been traveling for weeks." "I heard," Caleb said, nodding toward the girls. "They said you need a job." "I do. I can work, Cal. I'm stronger than I look. I can fix that barn roof I saw sagging out back. I can handle the herd. I don't need much pay. Just a dry place for the girls. The hayloft is fine." Caleb looked at the man he had once thought about every single day for 5 years. He looked at the twins who were currently sharing a piece of stale hardtack Caleb had given them. "I'm going under Julian," Caleb said, his voice dropping so the kids wouldn't hear. "Croft holds the note on this place. I've got maybe 2 months before they auction it off. I can't pay you." Julian stepped closer. "I don't need money right now. I need a roof. If you lose the place in 2 months, then we move on. But for 2 months, let me help you fight for it." Caleb looked into Julian's eyes. He saw the fatigue there, but also a spark of the old fire. The Julian who had once dragged Caleb out of a collapsed mine shaft in Georgia. "And what about that nonsense the girls said?" Caleb asked quietly. "About you loving me?" Julian's face went rigid. He glanced at his daughters who were pretending not to listen. "I told them that—" Julian whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "Because I knew it was the only currency I had left with you. I knew you were too stubborn to hire a charity case. But I hoped you weren't too hard to turn away a man who—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "A man who remembers who you really are." It was a manipulation. It was a play on their shared history. And it worked. Caleb sighed, a long, rattling sound. "The bunkhouse is full of rats, but the stove works. There's clean straw in the barn for bedding until you clear the bunkhouse out." Julian's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you, Cal. Don't thank me." Caleb turned away to hide the conflict in his face. "We're up at 4. If you can't keep up, you're gone. I don't care who you are." "I'll be up at 3, Julian promised. The first week was a brutal education in the reality of time. The years had changed them. They weren't the young men who had raced horses in Savannah anymore. They were middle-aged, aching, and carrying the weight of the world. But God Julian could work. True to his word, Julian was up before dawn. He repaired the corral fence that had been down for 6 months. He groomed the horses until their coats shone like polished copper. He took over the cooking, turning Caleb's meager supplies of beans and salt pork into stews that actually had flavor. The twins Hattie and Clara were a force of nature. They treated the ranch like a playground, but they worked too. They collected eggs, hauled water, and waged a war against the barn cats. They brought a noise to the ranch, giggling, shouting, singing that grated on Caleb's nerves initially, but soon became a rhythm he found himself waiting for. However, the tension between the two men was a taut wire. One evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival, a blizzard was rolling in off the Bighorns. The cattle were scattered in the lower pasture, and they needed to be driven into the box canyon for shelter. "Ride out to the ridge," Caleb shouted over the wind, tightening the cinch on his stallion Reaper. "Turn the stragglers back." Julian mounted a roan mare Caleb had provided. He looked clumsy in the saddle compared to Caleb, but he didn't complain. They rode out into the biting whiteout. For 3 hours they fought the storm. The wind was so loud they had to use hand signals. Caleb watched Julian struggle to wrestle a stubborn bull calf out of a ravine. The calf kicked, knocking Julian into the mud. Caleb instinctively spurred Reaper forward, uncoiling his lasso. With a flick of his wrist, he roped the calf and dragged it clear. He jumped down, hauling Julian to his feet. "You all right?" Caleb yelled, gripping Julian's coat. "I'm fine," Julian shouted back, wiping mud from his eyes. "Just lost my footing. You're riding too stiff, loosen up, or the horse will throw you." They stood there for a moment, chests heaving, faces inches apart in the swirling snow. The physical proximity brought back a flood of memories for Caleb, nights by the campfire, the way Julian used to laugh the unspoken words that had driven Caleb west. Julian stared at him, the snow catching in his eyelashes. "You got good at this, Cal. You're a real cowboy now." "Had to be," Caleb muttered, letting go of him. "Survival isn't pretty." "No," Julian said softly, his voice cutting through the wind. "It isn't. But you built something here. It's worth saving." "It's already lost," Caleb spat, turning back to his horse. "Croft is coming for the deed on the 1st of the month. I'm short $300. "We'll find it," Julian said. "How are you going to conjure gold from horse manure?" "I have an idea," Julian said, "but you have to trust me." Caleb stopped. "Trust you? You left me in Georgia, Julian. You chose Mary. You chose the safe life." It was the first time they had spoken of it openly. Julian flinched, as if struck. "I didn't choose the safe life, Cal. I chose the life I thought I was supposed to have. And look where it got me. Broke, widowed, and begging my—" He stopped, begging my oldest friend for a job. Is that all we are, friends? Caleb asked the question, hanging dangerous and heavy. Before Julian could answer, a gunshot echoed from the direction of the ranch house. The twins. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Caleb's chest. He vaulted onto Reaper. The girls! They rode hard, the horses slipping on the icy ground. When they crested the hill overlooking the farmhouse, they saw a black carriage parked in the yard. 2 men with rifles stood by the porch, and standing on the porch holding Hattie by the arm, while Clara screamed and kicked at his shins, was Jedediah Croft. Caleb didn't think. He didn't calculate. He drew his peacemaker and fired a warning shot into the air, spurring Reaper into a gallop down the slope. "Get your hands off them!" Caleb roared, the sound tearing from his throat. Croft, a rotund man in a beaver fur coat, released Hattie, who scrambled back to her sister. He smiled, a greasy, calm expression that made Caleb's skin crawl. "Just a friendly visit, Mr. Mercer." Croft called out, his voice oily smooth. "I saw smoke. Wondered if you had squatters. Seems you do." Caleb pulled his horse up, leveling his gun at Croft's chest. Julian rode up beside him, sliding off his horse and running to the girls, gathering them into his arms. "They aren't squatters," Caleb said, his hammer cocked. "They're my family." The word slipped out before he could stop it. Croft's eyebrows raised. He looked at Julian, then at the twins, and finally back at Caleb. A look of malicious recognition dawned on his face. "Family." Croft chuckled. "Well, that's interesting. Because I know this man. Mr. Hayes, isn't it?" Julian went pale, holding his daughters tight. "I believe," Croft said, pulling a piece of paper from his coat, "that Mr. Hayes here still owes the Nebraska bank a significant sum. A debt that my bank has recently purchased." Caleb's heart hammered. He looked at Julian. Julian wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the ground, shame burning his ears. "You see, Caleb," Croft smiled, waving the paper. "If you take on Mr. Hayes, you take on his debts too. By my count, you don't just owe me for the broken spoke anymore. You owe me for Mr. Hayes's failed farm too, which means I don't have to wait until the 1st of the month." Croft's eyes gleamed. "I can seize your livestock tomorrow." Caleb lowered the gun slowly, the cold reality settling in. Julian hadn't just brought help. He had brought the final nail in the coffin. "Julian?" Caleb asked, his voice broken. Julian looked up, tears in his eyes. "I didn't know, Cal. I swear. I didn't know he bought the debt." "Get off my land," Caleb whispered to Croft. "Gladly." Croft tipped his hat. "I'll be back at dawn with the sheriff to collect the herd. Enjoy your family reunion, Mr. Mercer." As the carriage rolled away, leaving them in the snow, Caleb looked at Julian. The love, the history, the Papa loves you. It all felt like a trap now. "Get the girls inside," Caleb said, his voice dead. "Cal, please." "Get them inside," Caleb roared, "before I do something I regret." The farmhouse kitchen, usually a place of warmth, felt colder than the blizzard raging outside. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock and the occasional pop of a pine knot in the stove. Caleb stood by the window, staring out into the black abyss of the storm. His reflection in the glass was ghostly, a man hollowed out by betrayal. Behind him, Julian sat at the table, his head in his hands. The twins had been sent to the loft, though the creaking of the floorboards above suggested they were awake, pressing their ears to the cracks to listen. "You should have told me," Caleb said. His voice wasn't a shout anymore. It was a low, jagged rumble. "You let me open my door, let me feed your children all while knowing you were dragging an anchor that would sink us both." Julian looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale in the lantern light. "I didn't know he sold the debt to Croft, Cal. In Nebraska, the bank manager was a man named Silas Thorne. He told me he'd hold the note until spring, I thought I had time. Time. Caleb turned, his limp more pronounced as he paced the room. Men like us don't get a time, Julian. We get luck and we get grit. And you just spent the last of mine. Caleb grabbed the whiskey bottle from the counter and poured a glass, downing it in one burning swallow. He didn't offer one to Julian. I'll leave, Julian said quietly. I'll pack the wagon. We'll be gone before sunrise. Maybe if we leave, Croft will back off. Don't be a fool, Caleb snapped. Croft doesn't want you. He wants this land. He wants the water rights to the creek that runs through the south pasture. He's been trying to starve me out for 2 years. Your debt is just the excuse he needed to bring the sheriff and seize the herd legally. If you leave, he still takes the cattle, and then I lose the ranch anyway. Julian stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the wood. He walked over to Caleb, stopping just inches away. The smell of wet wool and tobacco clung to him, a scent that Caleb found painfully familiar. Then let's fight him, Julian said. Caleb scoffed. With what 2 rusty Winchesters and a crippled leg, the sheriff has 5 deputies. Croft has hired guns. Not with guns, Julian said, his voice gaining strength. With the herd. If Croft shows up at dawn to seize the cattle, let him find an empty corral. Caleb narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Move the herd, Julian urged, his eyes lighting up with a desperate intensity. Tonight, in the storm. They won't expect anyone to be crazy enough to drive 500 head of cattle through a blizzard. That's suicide, Caleb muttered. The drifts are 3 feet deep in the pass. Not the pass, Julian countered. The blind man's hollow. Caleb froze. The hollow. That's a box canyon, surrounded by shale cliffs. It's a death trap. It's a shelter, Julian insisted. I saw it when I was mending the fence line last week. The wind blows over the top, not into it. If we can get the herd in there, the snow will cover our tracks by morning. Croft will think the storm scattered them. He can't seize what he can't find. Caleb looked at Julian. He saw the same reckless brilliance that had once convinced Caleb to invest in a doomed gold mine in Georgia. But he also saw something else, a fierce determination to protect his daughters, to protect Caleb. It's 5 miles of ice and rock, Caleb said softly. In the dark. I can ride point, Julian said. You take the flank. We can do it, Cal, like we used to drive the stubborn mules in Savannah. Caleb looked at the man he had loved in silence for half a lifetime. He was angry, furious even, but the thought of Julian riding out into the storm alone or leaving with his children to freeze on the roadside was a physical pain in Caleb's chest. If we lose a single cow, Caleb warned, pointing a calloused finger at Julian's chest, I'm taking it out of your hide. Julian managed a weak, tired smile. Deal. Caleb grabbed his coat from the hook. Go wake the girls. They can't stay here alone if Croft comes early. We'll bundle them in the wagon and tie it to the back of the supply mule. They stay at the rear. You and I, we have a long night ahead. The wind outside was a physical weight, a wall of white noise that battered them the moment they stepped off the porch. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. The sleet had turned to hard, stinging pellets of snow that felt like buckshot against the skin. The next 4 hours were a blur of adrenaline and misery. Caleb rode Reaper, his black stallion, cutting a path through the drifts. Julian was on the roan mare, riding back and forth along the line of shivering cattle, whistling and shouting to get them moving. The cows were reluctant, lowing in distress, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Hey, move on. Julian's voice was torn away by the gale, but he kept at it, slapping his lariat against his chaps. They moved the herd slowly, a dark river of muscle and horn flowing through the white landscape. The wagon, covered in a heavy tarpaulin, trundled behind them. Inside, Hattie and Clara were buried under every blanket Caleb owned, clutching each other for warmth. The journey to Blind Man's Hollow required them to cross the Devil's Throat, a narrow ridge with a sheer drop on one side and a steep, unstable scree slope on the other. In summer, it was treacherous. In a blizzard, it was madness. "Keep them close to the wall," Caleb roared, guiding the lead steer. The wind howled through the canyon, creating a vacuum sound that disoriented the animals. A young heifer panicked, slipping on a patch of black ice near the edge. She went down with a terrified bellow, sliding toward the drop. "No!" Julian screamed. Before Caleb could shout a warning, Julian spurred the roan mare forward. He didn't think. He reacted. He rode between the sliding heifer and the edge, using his horse's body as a shield. The mare scrambled for purchase sparks flying from her shoes as she struck stone. The heifer slammed into the mare's flank, bouncing off and scrambling back up the slope to safety. But the impact knocked the mare off balance. Her back legs slipped over the edge. "Julian!" Caleb screamed. For a heart-stopping second, horse and rider hung over the abyss. Julian threw his weight forward, grabbing the mare's mane. The horse gave a mighty heave, her muscles bunching, and clawed her way back onto the trail. Julian slumped over the saddle, gasping for air. Caleb rode back to him, reaching out to grab Julian's jacket. "You idiot! You could have gone over." Julian lifted his head. His face was white as the snow, his lips blue, but his eyes were blazing. "Saved the cow, didn't I?" Caleb stared at him. The anger he had been holding on to. The resentment of the abandonment. The debt, the intrusion began to crack. Underneath it was just fear. Terrifying, paralyzing fear of losing this man again. "Yeah," Caleb choked out. "You saved the cow. Now keep moving before I push you off myself." They pushed on. By the time they reached Blind Man's Hollow, the storm was at its peak. They drove the cattle into the natural amphitheater of the canyon. The high rock walls blocked the wind, creating a pocket of relative calm. The snow fell straight down here, burying the herd's tracks within minutes. They set up a makeshift camp under a rock overhang. Caleb unhitched the wagon and carried the sleeping twins to a bed of dry pine needles and blankets near a small fire he managed to start. Julian collapsed by the fire, his hands shaking so hard he couldn't unbutton his coat. "Here," Caleb said, kneeling beside him. He battered Julian's hands away and undid the buttons himself. He pulled the frozen coat off and draped a dry woolen blanket over Julian's shoulders. "We did it," Julian chattered, his teeth clicking together. "We ain't out of the woods yet," Caleb said, pouring coffee from a thermos he'd packed. He handed the tin cup to Julian. Their fingers brushed. Caleb didn't pull away this time. Julian held the cup with both hands, the steam warming his face. He looked at Caleb over the rim. "Why didn't you come to the wedding, Cal?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm. Caleb poked the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "You know why. I wanted you to be my best man," Julian said softly. "Mary asked for you. She knew how close we were." "She didn't know everything," Caleb murmured. He looked at Julian. "I couldn't watch you say those vows, Julian. I could handle you being with her. She was a good woman. But I couldn't stand there and watch you promise your life to someone else when—" "When what?" Julian whispered. "When I had built my whole life around the idea that we'd end up on the same patch of dirt," Caleb admitted. The truth was out. It lay between them, naked and vulnerable. Julian set the cup down. He reached out his hand, trembling, and touched Caleb's bearded cheek. His thumb traced the scar on Caleb's jaw. "I thought I had to do the right thing," Julian said, his voice breaking. "My father, society, they expected a wife, a family. I loved Mary, Cal, I really did. But it wasn't the kind of love that keeps you warm in a storm like this. I missed you every day. Every time I looked at the sunset, I wondered if you were seeing it too." Caleb turned his face into Julian's palm, closing his eyes. For a moment, the years of hardness melted away. "I'm here now," Julian whispered. "I'm not going anywhere, unless you kick me out." Caleb opened his eyes. They were dark, intense. "You ain't going anywhere, but we have to survive tomorrow first." The dawn broke cold and brittle. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and white. The Laramie Valley was a blinding sheet of snow. When Jedediah Croft and the sheriff, a weary man named Elias Thorne, rode up to the Broken Spoke Ranch at 8:00 a.m., they found the house dark and the corrals empty. Caleb and Julian were watching from the ridge line, hidden in the tree line a mile away. They had left the girls with the wagon in the hollow and ridden back to face the music. They watched as Croft kicked open the barn doors. They watched him storm around the empty yard, his gestures wild and angry. "He's madder than a wet hen," Julian noted, peering through a brass spyglass. "Let's go say hello," Caleb said, checking the load in his colt. They rode down the mountain, not to the ranch, but toward the town of Laramie. They needed answers before they confronted Croft. Caleb had a hunch. They arrived in town just as the businesses were opening. Laramie was a collection of clapboard buildings and muddy streets. They tied their horses in front of the land office. "Stay here," Caleb told Julian. "If Croft sees you, he'll have you arrested for the debt. I need to check the registry." Caleb limped into the land office. The clerk, a bespectacled young man named Percival, looked up. "Mr. Mercer surprised you made it in, after the storm. Need to see the survey maps for the Valley Percy, specifically the hydrological surveys from last year." Percival frowned. "That's odd. Mr. Croft checked those out yesterday. Said he was updating the bank's collateral files." "Did he bring them back?" "No, sir. But, well, I shouldn't say this, but he was arguing with the surveyor, Mr. Gantry. I heard them shouting in the back room of the saloon last night." Caleb's instincts flared. "Where is Gantry now?" "He stays at the boarding house on Main, but he's likely sleeping it off." Caleb thanked him and exited. He grabbed Julian. "Come on, we're finding the surveyor." They found Arthur Gantry hungover and shivering on the porch of the boarding house. He was a small, wiry man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous twitch. Caleb didn't waste time. He stepped onto the porch, grabbed Gantry by the lapels, and slammed him against the wall. "Hey, what the—" "Shut up, Gantry," Caleb growled. "Tell me about the water under my land." Gantry's eyes widened. He looked at Julian, then back at Caleb. "I don't know what you mean." "Croft is trying to foreclose on me today," Caleb said. "He bought my friend's debt just to leverage me out. He doesn't do that for a few hundred head of cattle." "What did you find on the Broken Spoke?" Gantry swallowed hard. "He'll kill me if I talk." "I'll kill you if you don't," Caleb lied, pressing the barrel of his uncocked gun into Gantry's ribs. "And I'll make it hurt." Okay, Gantry stammered. "It's not just water. It's the aquifer. It's the biggest source in the valley. But that ain't the main thing. It's the railroad." "The railroad?" Julian asked. "The line is 50 miles north." "Not the new spur," Gantry whispered. "Union Pacific is planning a spur to the copper mines in the south. They need a water depot. The only viable spot for a refill station is your south pasture, Mr. Mercer. The contract for that water right alone is worth $50,000. Caleb and Julian exchanged a stunned look. $50,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to build a kingdom. "Croft knows?" Caleb asked. "Knows he brokered the deal," Gantry spat. "He's been sitting on the news driving you into bankruptcy so he can snatch the land for pennies and sell it to the Union Pacific next month." Caleb released Gantry. The anger in his gut was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. "He tried to steal my life," Caleb said. "He tried to ruin you." He looked at Julian, "just to get to me." "What do we do?" Julian asked. "If he has the sheriff, he can still arrest us for the debt." "Not if we pay it," Caleb said. "With what we're broke, Cal." Caleb looked toward the center of town, where the bank stood a brick fortress of greed. "We're not broke. We own the most valuable piece of dirt in Wyoming. We just need to prove it to the one man in this town who hates Croft more than I do." "Who don't?" "Judge Thaddeus Moore." Caleb smiled grimly. "He retires next week, and he's been looking for a reason to hang Croft out to dry for 20 years. Caleb and Julian walked into the courthouse. It was a bold move. They were dusty, smelling of cattle and sweat, walking into the halls of justice. Judge Moore was in his chambers packing books into a crate. He was a lion of a man with a white mane of hair and a voice that sounded like grinding rocks. "Mercer," the judge grunted, "you look like you've been dragged through a knothole backwards." "I have, Judge," Caleb said. "This is Julian Hayes, my partner." The judge eyed Julian. "The man with the debt." "The man with the evidence," Julian corrected, placing a shaky hand on the desk. He wasn't the timid man from the kitchen anymore. He was fighting for his family. They laid it out. Gantry's confession, which they had dragged Gantry in to repeat the timing of the foreclosure, the hidden railroad contract. The judge listened, stroking his beard. His face grew darker with every word. "That son of a bitch," Moore muttered. "Insider trading, fraud, extortion." "We need an injunction," Caleb said. "Stop the foreclosure. Give us time to negotiate directly with the Union Pacific." "I can do better than that." The judge stood up, grabbing his cane. "I can freeze Croft's assets pending an investigation, but we need to do it publicly. He's holding a town auction at noon to sell off your abandoned property." Caleb checked the clock. It was 11:45 a.m. "Let's go to an auction," Caleb said. The town square was packed. Croft stood on a makeshift podium, the sheriff beside him. He looked triumphant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Croft bellowed, "due to the abandonment of the Broken Spoke Ranch and the outstanding debts of its owner and his associates, we are auctioning the deed to the land today." The crowd murmured. People liked Caleb. They didn't like seeing him fail. "Do I hear $100? Croft started. "I bid 50,000. The voice cracked like a whip across the square. The crowd parted. Caleb walked down the center of the muddy street, Julian at his right side, the judge at his left. Croft's face went the color of curdled milk. "Mercer, you have no money." "I have the land," Caleb said, stepping up to the podium. He faced the crowd. "And I have the water. And according to the Union Pacific Railroad contract, you've been hiding in your safe that water is worth a hell of a lot more than my mortgage." A gasp went through the crowd. "Sheriff!" Croft screamed. "Arrest him! He's trespassing! He's in default!" Sheriff Thorne looked at Caleb, then at Judge Moore. "Sheriff," the judge boomed, "if you touch him, you'll be sharing a cell with Mr. Croft. I have signed a warrant for Jedediah Croft's arrest on charges of fraud and grand larceny." The silence was absolute. Then slowly the sheriff stepped away from Croft. "You can't do this," Croft shrieked, backing up. "I am the bank." "You're a crook," Julian said, stepping forward. He looked Croft in the eye. "And you threatened my daughters." Julian drew back his fist, a fist hardened by weeks of ranch work and years of frustration, and connected squarely with Croft's jaw. Crack. Croft crumpled to the mud, unconscious. The crowd erupted. Cheers, laughter, and applause filled the cold air. Caleb looked at Julian, who was shaking out his hand, looking stunned by his own violence. "Nice right hook," Caleb said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "I learned from the best." Julian grinned breathlessly. But as the sheriff hauled Croft away, Caleb saw something that stopped his heart. A rider was coming in from the mountain road. It was Hattie riding the supply mule, bareback, screaming. "Papa, Mr. Caleb!" They ran to her. "Hattie, what is it?" "Where's Clara?" Hattie slid off the mule, sobbing. "The fire. We made a fire in the canyon because we were cold. But the wind, the brush, it caught." "Clara." Julian shook her shoulders. "Where is Clara?" "She's trapped," Hattie screamed. "The fire blocked the canyon entrance. She's still in the hollow with the cows." The victory vanished. The money didn't matter. The land didn't matter. Caleb looked at Julian. The color had drained from Julian's face. "Get fresh horses," Caleb commanded the sheriff, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Now." The horses tore up the mountain road, their hooves throwing clods of frozen mud and slush into the air. Caleb was bent low over the neck of a fresh bay gelding the sheriff had provided grit stinging his eyes. Beside him, Julian rode with the desperation of a man, possessed his face a mask of pure terror. They didn't speak. The smoke rising from the north was language enough. It was a thick black pillar staining the pristine winter sky, marking the location of Blind Man's Hollow. "She knows to stay low," Julian shouted over the wind, trying to convince himself as much as Caleb. "She knows fire safety." "The fire isn't the problem," Caleb yelled back, his voice raw. "It's the herd. If they panic in that box canyon, there's nowhere to go but over her." The thought hung between them, terrifying and real. 500 head of cattle, spooked by smoke and trapped in a stone cul-de-sac, would become a meat grinder. They crested the final ridge and looked down into the hollow. It was worse than Caleb had feared. The brush that lined the narrow entrance to the canyon, dried sage pine scrub, and deadfall was a wall of orange flame. The wind was whipping the fire inward, feeding the beast. Inside the canyon, through the haze of smoke, they could hear the low, thunderous rumble of the cattle milling in a circle, a whirlpool of panic. "Clara!" Julian screamed, sliding his horse to a halt. "She won't hear you!" Caleb barked. He surveyed the scene with the tactical eye of a man who had survived range wars. "We can't go through the entrance. The heat will kill the horses before we get 10 yards. "Then how?" Julian grabbed Caleb's arm, his grip bruising. "Tell me how Caleb pointed to the scree slope, the steep, jagged wall of loose rock on the west side. It was the only way down that wasn't on burning. "We have to slide down the shale, on foot." "My leg." Caleb started, then stopped. He looked at the fire. He looked at Julian. "Never mind. Grab the lariats. All of them." They abandoned the horses and scrambled to the edge of the cliff. The drop was 50 feet of shifting, razor-sharp rock. Caleb tied 3 lariats together, anchoring one end to a sturdy ironwood root. "You go first," Caleb ordered. "You're lighter. Find her. I'll come down behind you to cover your back." Julian didn't hesitate. He wrapped the rope around his arm and practically leaped down the slope, sliding in a cloud of dust and stone. He hit the canyon floor, running, disappearing into the acrid yellow smoke. Caleb followed. His bad knee screamed in protest with every jarring step, sending white-hot lances of pain up his thigh. He gritted his teeth, sweat mingling with the soot on his face, and forced himself down. When he reached the bottom, the heat was suffocating. The air tasted of ash and fear. "Clara Hattie," Julian's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Over here, Papa!" The scream came from the far back of the canyon, near the rock overhang where they had camped. Caleb and Julian ran, dodging panicked steers that loomed out of the smoke like monsters. They found the girls huddled in a small crevice of the rock wall. Hattie had her arms wrapped around Clara, shielding her sister with her own small body. Clara was coughing, her face streaked with tears and soot, but she was alive. Julian fell to his knees, gathering both of them into his arms. He buried his face in their hair, sobbing with relief. "I've got you. I've got you." "Papa, the cows!" Hattie cried, pointing. Caleb turned. The wind had shifted. The fire at the entrance was pushing the smoke deeper into the canyon. The herd, blinded and terrified, was backing up. They were compressing toward the back wall towards the girls. A wall of muscle and horn weighing tons was slowly crushing inward. "We have to move," Caleb shouted. "Up the slope now." "We can't," Julian yelled, coughing. "The rope is gone. The fire burned the root." Caleb looked up. Sure enough, the rope lay in a smouldering heap at the bottom of the cliff. They were trapped. The cattle were 20 feet away and closing. The lead bull, a massive beast with a white face, was pawing the ground, eyes rolling in madness. If he charged, the whole herd would follow. Caleb looked at the girls. He looked at Julian. He realized there was only one way to turn the herd. It required a threat bigger than the fire. "Get them into the crevice," Caleb ordered Julian. "Push them as deep as they can go and cover them with your coat. What are you going to do?" Julian demanded, panic rising in his voice. Caleb drew his peacemaker. He didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the herd. "Caleb!" Julian screamed. Caleb ignored him. He walked straight at the lead bull, limping heavily. He stopped 10 feet from the beast. The heat was blistering. The roar of the fire was deafening. Caleb raised the gun, but he didn't aim at the bull. He aimed at the sky. Bang! 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 The shots rang out sharp and cracking. The bull flinched. Caleb took a deep breath. He holstered the gun. Then he did something he hadn't done since he was a boy in Savannah. He let out a rebel yell, a primal, piercing scream of defiance that cut through the roar of the flames. He waved his arms, slapping his coat against his legs, making himself big. "Yah, get back! Hey-yah!" The bull, confused by this new predator that didn't fear the fire, hesitated. Caleb lunged forward, slapping the bull across the nose with his hat. It was madness. It was suicide. But the bull turned. It bellowed and swung its massive head, pushing back against the cows behind it. The momentum shifted. The herd, seeing a gap in the aggression, began to swirl away from the back wall, circling toward the center of the canyon, where the air was clearer. Caleb stood his ground, a lone figure against a tide of beef, holding the line with sheer will. But as the herd turned, a stray heifer kicked out. Her hoof caught Caleb square in his bad knee. There was a sickening crunch. Caleb went down. The world spun into darkness. The last thing he saw was Julian running toward him, emerging from the smoke like an avenging angel. Pain. That was the first thing Caleb knew. A deep throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He opened his eyes. He was in his own bed. The quilt was heavy and warm. The smell of antiseptic and sage tea filled the room. He tried to sit up, but a hand gently pushed him back. "Easy, cowboy. You're not going anywhere." It was Julian. He was sitting in the chair by the bedside, looking exhausted, but clean. His hand rested on Caleb's chest. "The girls," Caleb rasped. His throat felt like he'd swallowed a handful of sand. "They're fine," Julian said, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Hattie has a scraped knee, and Clara is missing her eyebrows, but they're fine. They're sleeping in the loft." Caleb let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for days. The herd, most of them made it. The fire burned itself out when the wind died down. We lost a few, but we have enough. Caleb looked down at his leg. It was splintered and wrapped heavily in bandages. "Doc says you tore the ligament again," Julian said quietly. "Says you'll need a cane for the rest of your life. No more riding rough stock." Caleb stared at the ceiling. "I'm done with rough stock anyway. I'm getting too old for heroics." "You certainly are," Julian agreed. He leaned closer, his expression turning serious. "You saved them, Cal. You walked into the fire for us." "I told you," Caleb muttered, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. "I protect what's mine." Julian went still. "Is that what we are?" "Yours?" Caleb looked at him. The barriers were gone. The years of silence, the misunderstanding, the hurt, it had all burned away in the canyon. "You've always been mine, Julian," Caleb whispered. "Even when you were hers, even when you were 1,000 miles away. You were the only thing I ever really wanted." Julian's eyes filled with tears. He leaned down, resting his forehead against Caleb's. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." "You're here now," Caleb said, reaching up to thread his fingers through Julian's hair. "And you owe me a barn roof." Julian laughed, a wet, choked sound. "I'll build you a whole new barn, with the railroad money. We got the contract." Judge Moore delivered it himself this morning. Croft is in a cell in Cheyenne. The Union Pacific rep is coming next week to sign the papers. We're rich, Cal." Caleb closed his eyes, savoring the feeling of Julian's closeness. "I don't care about the money." "I know." Julian kissed his forehead. "Rest now. Papa loves you." Caleb smiled. "Don't push your luck." The spring of 1889. The spring came early to the Laramie Valley. The snowmelt turned the creek into a roaring river, and the meadows exploded with wildflowers, purple lupine, and yellow arrowleaf balsam root. The Broken Spoke Ranch was unrecognizable. A new barn stood proud against the skyline, painted a deep red. The corrals were reinforced with new timber. A water tower bearing the Union Pacific logo stood in the south pasture, a monument to their victory. On the porch of the farmhouse, Caleb sat in a rocking chair, a polished hickory cane resting across his knees. He was watching the twins chase a new litter of puppies through the tall grass. Their laughter was a constant song that had chased the ghosts out of the old house. The screen door creaked open. Julian stepped out, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He looked healthy, his face filled out the shadows under his eyes gone. He wore a new Stetson and a shirt that wasn't patched. "Supper time in 10 minutes, Julian said, handing Caleb a glass. "Roast chicken." "You spoil them," Caleb grumbled, though he took the glass with a smile. "I spoil you," Julian corrected. He sat on the railing looking out at the valley. "Hattie asked me today if we were going to stay here forever." Caleb took a sip of the tart sweet drink. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that we put down roots, and roots don't move." Caleb reached out and took Julian's hand. His grip was strong, calloused, and permanent. "She's a smart girl," Caleb said. Julian squeezed his hand. "She takes after her Uncle Cal." "Papa Cal," Caleb corrected softly. Julian smiled, radiant as the setting sun. "Papa Cal." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the bighorns, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The wind blew through the valley, but it didn't scream anymore. It whispered. It whispered of home, of forgiveness, and of a love that had survived the storm to find its season in the sun. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Mercer didn't check for his gun. He just held Julian's hand and watched the stars come out one by one. And that is the story of the Broken Spoke Ranch. They say that blood is thicker than water, but Caleb and Julian proved that love, the kind that endures decades of silence and miles of distance, is stronger than both. They fought the bank, the blizzard, and the fire, not for gold, but for the chance to finally be a family. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If those 2 little girls hadn't knocked on that door, if they hadn't delivered that secret message, would Caleb have let the winter take him? Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to draw a gun, but to open a door. If this story touched your heart, please do me a huge favor, hit that like button. It helps get these stories to more people who need a little hope. And if you want more tales of the Wild West, true grit and romance, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell. I want to know, what would you have done if your old flame showed up after 10 years with a debt and 2 kids? Would you have let them in? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.